Hi, welcome to the Diablo podcast. We are online at diabloinkgamers.com. I'm your host. I'm named Flux, on the internet at least, and I'm joined by Xanth,
Ahoy hoy.
who's still doing victory laps over his Witch Doctor 100.
And how was your journey to Paragon 100, by the way, Flux?
Almost there, later for that. And also by Azzure.
Howdy, howdy.
And we are doing this a little bit backwards. Azzure has to run and do some real-life entertaining of relatives very shortly, so we're going to jump right into a little bit of Loot 1.5 console stuff. And then after that, Azzure will take part in that and lecture us all about the items, which he knows better than anybody else, even though he doesn't play the game at all. And then Xanth and I will talk about recent character stuff, and he can continue his victory laps. Okay, so I just did a podcast with the console about the console with two guys who've been playing it for a week, and that will be airing before this podcast. And obviously, neither of you guys have heard it, but they were very positive about it. They liked a lot of the stuff, but one of the main topics we got into was the items, and people are calling the console Loot 1.5. And there are some changes, mainly bigger numbers, but also you find a lot more legendaries. You find a lot fewer but better rares. Rares are highly targeted. They said they almost always find with the main stat for your current class. Rankill was saying that he's been playing a Witch Doctor, and all he finds is gear with intelligence on it. And he was using a Scoundrel for a while, but he couldn't find any useful gear for a Scoundrel. So he had to get an Enchantress, because every damn thing he found had 250 intelligence on it, that kind of thing. So it does have some interesting effects. And he said he kept finding crossbows that had intelligence on them. So they were useless. You know, he couldn't ever twink them because you would never want intelligence on as a main stat on your crossbow with your demon hunter, right? So it's kind of a funny, some mixed blessings there. But his main conclusion was that it's just Loot 1.1 that's been doubled, as Jay Wilson would say, right? It's just bigger numbers. You have the exact same situation long term. All you want is crit and crit chance and IAS and main stat, etc. And you just get a lot bigger numbers and you find a lot better gear. And before you can get a chance to soliloquy here, Azzure, I will ask Xanth a quick question. His Witch Doctor, obviously you are a Witch Doctor expert.
Clearly.
Yes. Are you flexing right now? Are you kissing your biceps like Colin Kaepernick when he scores a touchdown on your team and beats you? Anyway,
yeah.
His Paragon 4 Witch Doctor, entirely self-found, one pass. He said he's done one farming run in Act 1, but it's basically just one time through the game. What would you guess his DPS and what's the other number? Hit points are on his Paragon 4 Witch Doctor?
I don't know. If I were to guess, maybe in terms of DPS, 60,000, because I'm already just going to skew higher because I'm being asked this question, and the hit points, I don't know, maybe 50,000?
125, 95k. DPS and hit points.
Jesus.
And that's Paragon 4. I mean, you could obviously do that with Paragon 4 now, but you'd be spending an awful lot of time in the auction house to make that happen, right? He said he's found upwards of 50 legendaries so far. Which is, obviously that's, 15 a difficulty level almost, so.
Right, and have they been, obviously scaling more towards the Witch Doctor class? Like, was he finding things of the deep or anything like that?
He has found a really good thing of the deep, he said, but mainly, he's found a mixture of stuff, but everything he finds has like 250 intelligence and 180 vitality, that kind of thing, so. And that's Paragon 4, he'll do 5 runs and probably replace half his gear.
Yeah.
So, it seems like but he said it's just exactly like the PC version. You want all the same stuff, just with bigger numbers. And so people who have been complaining and saying, why don't we have this system on the PC now? Why don't we have bigger numbers? Why don't we have more legendary findings? And one of our other guests, our distinguished Australian colleague, has long maintained that merely increasing the numbers would not make any difference, and everyone would be in the exact same position in a month, just with higher figures. And would you like to take a victory lap now, Azzure?
Sure. Well, I think there's two ways of looking at this. One is that the console is indeed a manifestation of what they want to do with the loot system, which is what they said. And so what we can expect is similar to something that is happening on the console in the expansion pack. Now, that's obviously making a few assumptions, but the main assumption is what they said, and that's that the console is kind of like a Loot 1.5 version, and they're sort of moving in that direction. Now, the problem with that is what Flux sort of just hinted at, that it's simply increasing the numbers and raising the floor, so to speak, is really absolutely not the right solution to what people actually want out of the game. The main complaint about loot is not that the numbers are too low. I think it's the opposite. I think the numbers are getting ridiculously high, but it's more that the items are not meaningful and they're not fun to find. And they're not fun to find because they're not meaningful, and they don't really, influence your build. They're sort of just a linear, homogeneous sort of path that you just continue to iterate on, which is very different to what a lot of us who played Diablo 2 experienced. And it feels a bit more like it's been dumbed down. It's a bit more like World of Warcraft item system where you have your primary stat and really you don't care about that. You don't care about anything else except that and a few other little stats. So I think the whole system just feels like they're a bit confused at Blizzard. Like that, it feels like they're sort of doing it in a clumsy way where they really don't know what to do. I don't think they really understand the fundamental problems of the system. And I don't know if Flux and Xanth, you guys feel like it feels a bit lost in the direction they're taking?
I mean, to jump in, I think one of the things, about the itemization system that has really always bothered me has been that the main hand weapon is just the biggest difference between doing 10,000 DPS and 100,000. If we're harking back to, Diablo 2, my weapon, yeah, it played a factor, but it was more about how I had built my character, the skills I had chosen that made it powerful. And now it's just the best deal I can get off the auction house for just that one slot, not even really taking into account everything else.
The benefit is that Blizzard didn't claim the console had fixed all the item problems. They just said it's a port. It's a port plus, I guess you'd say, or a double port or something, and it improved things and they made some tweaks and changes, but it's not meant to fix all the current problems, and that's what they're going to do in Loot 2.0 in the expansion, and then later, and it's going to be the free patch for D3C and for D3X, and when that comes out, then you can tell us how it's failed again, Azzure.
Look forward to it. But
yeah, so they didn't claim the console was a whole re-innovation of anything. It's just instant gratification version of the PC. And both the guys are like, this is awesome. I love finding this really cool stuff. I like finding upgrades all the time. And it just seems like the question is going to be, what will you do in a month?
I think two things. I'll sort of answer that in two ways. One is if the console, I understand that the console, they probably make loot a bit quicker to acquire and easier to acquire because it's a console, and all console games are casual friendly. They're all 12-year-old kids running and wanting to get all the loot, really sort of short-term benefits. That's just the demographic of a console gamer, as opposed to a PC gamer who are more in there for the long term and that sort of stuff. So I understand if that's what they've done for the console, then that's fine. It's the right decision. They're catering to the demographic, but I think they did specifically say this is. They're not saying. I'm not saying that they're claiming that this is the complete solution. I'm just claiming that they said this is the way they're headed in terms of what we can expect in the PC updated version of Loot 2.0. And I mean, if the other thing you got to add to that is what they've already shown us with the expansion in the Gamescom presentation, and that sort of looks like what we're seeing in the console. It's a little bit of the same sort of thing, minus the mystic, of course. But it kind of feels like they really aren't. I mean, I was hoping to see the first thing in the presentation about items, seeing this awesome, new style legendaries where we completely overhauled the system. You've got items that are really awesome for certain builds, really diverse. But instead, we kind of, I don't know, the examples were really poor, as I mentioned in the last podcast. And I just feel like they sincerely do not know what it is that they need to do to improve the item system. I mean, the console is probably a poor way of measuring how well they're doing, but when you combine that with the expansion preview, I think it is safe to say that they still don't really have something concrete that the community as a whole is saying, wow, that's actually going to fix itemization.
I'm kind of in league. I mean, I definitely get where the console's at and what it's supposed to do. But, I mean, obviously it was headed by, the new game director for Diablo, and that's Josh.
Joshy Washy.
Yeah. So you kind of...
Twinkle Toes.
I think you can glean some information from it because it was kind of his baby that he got to put his spin on. And, some of those ideas are going to carry over a little bit. But, I kind of do hope that there is still something behind the veil that we haven't seen in terms of itemization. outside of being able to change what it looks like through transmogrification. Because I agree with Azzure, there are some glaring parts of it that could be in need of a dire remedy that just doesn't seem to be happening right now. Because even as we looked at the Gamescom items, and I think Azzure, you had brought this up in a different podcast, it was just the larger numbers with a couple little things that didn't, really seem to do much outside of an effect, that really we don't care that much about.
Proc effects, shiny things.
Right.
Hydras.
They mentioned a bunch of those some months ago when they were first talking about the new legendary stuff, and we haven't really heard them lately. But it was like boots that would give you like it would create an earthquake whenever you use leap and that kind of stuff. And I mean, as you know, that just sort of comes in the. We had this whole debate on the podcast last time when you were on Azzure about, are these build changing? I'm doing air quotes, so it's serious. Build changing, or are they just some cool bonus feature that will kind of make things more fun, but doesn't really make a big difference in the long term? And that seems to be the whole debate: is can they actually make things that are build changing, or will it just be a little bit of a twink? And we're seeing stuff like with the new Paragon system, you can do all those specific bonuses. And one of the ones that I had a good forum conversation about, I was seeing, was the cooldown stuff. And there's obviously one build in the entire game right now that has 0 cooldown. That's the most popular wizard build, the CM stuff, where you can keep casting a bunch of skills that have an 8 and 10 and 12-second cooldown immediately because you can use other stuff to kill that. And no other classes can really do that. Except, I guess there's like the 0 cooldown zombie dog explosion build with witch doctors.
Right.
Have you ever done that one, Xanth? Not at all?
I've tried it, but I couldn't get the right gear to make it work, and I've been in the mode of spamming bears, so
Yeah.
it just wasn't for me.
So if you imagine, if you had minus, 85% cooldown because of your Paragon points, can you that could certainly be build changing, at least for some witch doctor stuff. I'm not really sure how that would help the barbarian in any way, or the demon hunter, because they don't really have cooldowns. They're mostly limited by their resources. And even the monk, I guess you could do a lot of blazing wrath or something, but I don't know that would really help any other characters that much.
There was a glimmer of hope in that presentation. I think there was a screenshot of I think it was a weapon that reduced cooldowns.
A glimmer of hope in that presentation. Well, that's a little bit of a. Could you recast that a little less apocalyptically?
I mean, in terms of the itemization path, because one of the items actually had a stat that was build changing, and it was the only one out of the ones we saw, and that was a simple, reduces all your cooldowns by 10% or whatever it was, or by a second. I can't remember if it was a whole number or percentage. But that alone is a build changer, because all of a sudden, if you're stacking a bunch of cooldown reducing itemization, then you're suddenly going to open yourself up to builds that are cooldown heavy. And that is a build changer. That's the definition of a build changer. And that's what we want to see. We don't want to see a stupid little Hydra coming out and doing some passive DPS that affects every build in the same way. We want to see things that, as a player, I can go, okay, well, I really want this item because this item complements my build, and I really like my build, and I want to continue accumulating items that really specialize into the build I'm playing, rather than being able to simply swap my build and all my gear is identically powerful to depending. And the build doesn't matter at all. And that's something that I think a lot of people want, because it also introduces this feeling of permanency, which obviously Diablo 3, being a free spec system, doesn't really have. But I think itemization would have been a clever way of fixing that problem. But unfortunately, we're not really seeing those build-changing, interesting items that D2 sort of had with their uniques.
One of the things the devs have said is that a lot of the Wyatt, I think, said this recently, and I actually was reading an old forum post from Bashiok. That's how old it was when Bashiok still existed, but it was from like 2 years ago. And basically, it was saying that one of the reasons we don't have, we being, he was saying this about the game, is we don't have so many fixes and so many build-changing, amazing things on the items, because we put almost all of those onto rune effects. It was rune stones at the time, but it's since become just the various forms of your runes. And in Diablo 2 we had skills. Not to always compare everything to Diablo 2, but you can look at any skill in the game basically and say, okay, here, if this was an effect on an item, it would be like the most amazing item. You got your zombie bear wand or something like that, right? Where, ordinarily zombie charger just whatever, and if you have this one item, suddenly it becomes bears, and it's like the best kick-ass thing in the game.
Mm.
And that's kind of what we had a lot of in Diablo 2, but it seems like it's tougher for them in Diablo 3 because if they put an effect like that on an item, then people are like, why isn't this just a rune effect in Hydra? Why isn't there an effect in Hydra that makes it spawn from dead corpses, 25% of the time if they're within 10 yards of you or whatever, something like that. And instead, they're putting that on an item. So it's almost like it's hard to say what should be a legendary build changing effect and what is just a runestone effect. And maybe, if they get everybody wants new rune effects, we're going to talk a little bit later about what new skills they could put in from between 60 and 70. But I mean, how do you decide if you're the developers? Okay, here's a really awesome proc effect. Do we make it? Is it a build changer as a skill, or is it an item bonus?
Yeah.
And if you want to make Azzure happy, you put it on item, I guess.
No, my solution to, or my answer to that question is you differentiate them because I've always been against the direct buffing of skills and builds directly from an item. I don't like the fact that, the 300 spear or whatever it is, that simply says increases throw weapon skill damage by X amount. I'm not a believer in those. That's not what I want to see when I say
So what's a
build
build changing effect that's not a bonus to a given skill or a skill
this
tree or
is
whatever? We don't have skill
this
trees
is
anymore.
the problem because the attribute system, and this is I think I mentioned this to you, Flux, in private on Skype. The main problem to me is it sort of stems a bit deeper than the itemization and build system. It's more about the actual character system itself. When you've got I hate to bring up D2 all the time, but D2 it's the best example I can give. It's got things like Javazons, for example. They valued attack speed much higher than a Boazon because weapon damage didn't really affect a Javazon's Lightning Fury skill. I'm not saying that's what I want to say. I'm just saying that's an example of a stat where you can build a theming sort of stat that affects certain builds and skills in a way that makes those skills disproportionately better than they would ordinarily just by using, at the moment it's all sort of, you can take a whole set of gear, move it from your wizard and put it on your witch doctor, and you will have the exact same character power, quotation marks, as you would with your wizard. There's no differentiation, there's no variability. The builds are completely irrelevant. All that matters is that it's an intelligence-based, crit-based build. So my answer to your question is don't put direct buffing item affixes on items that buff skills. Do it in a more intelligent way and more creative way, where it sort of passively fits a theme of the type of build you're trying to achieve. And another good example is the poison theme in D2. A lot of Boazons and a few other classes would stack poison charms, like crap loads of poison charms. They would use a poison based weapon. And then what they'll do is they would literally want to infect as many monsters as possible just by hitting them once, because as you know, it's a damage over time. In D2 it was damage over time poison. It wasn't like instant poison like we have in D3. So
It
that
wasn't
was
it
build
wasn't
changing.
green fire either, yes.
Yeah. So that to me is awesome because suddenly you are now running this build that is based on a DOT poison type effect, and you start to value things. You don't care about white damage anymore. You don't care about weapon damage. You care about having the maximum amount of attack speed that you can infect monsters as quick as possible. And that's the kind of thing where crit no longer matters as much. You're more interested in other stats, and that's what I mean by build changing items. I don't mean an item that simply buffs a skill directly, because I think that's a really poor way of doing it. And I think that's kind of what they've been doing in the past, and I don't want to see any more of that.
So you want to jump in there, Azure? I mean, the other person, Xanth, and explain to him how that can be done and how you can make it so that Bashiak's grandmother can still understand it.
Um, I mean, I don't even know how you would do that. You'd have to break the homogenization of the classes. You'd have to break the fact that every class wants critical hit chance, critical hit damage, and attack speed. You'd just have to completely rework how all three of those things are used. Um, and I have no idea how you do it. Because,
Oh,
I mean, Azur's right. I mean, I can't take my Witch Doctor's gear and throw it on my Barbarian, all of it anyway. Um, but for the most part, it's those three big things that will, make or break the character. And that is kind of disappointing because in D2 you never could do that really. were there some items and some things that you could transfer over? Sure. But by and large, you needed to build for your particular class.
And that's sort of why I was hoping they'll do it in an expansion pack, because I knew this change wouldn't simply be a patch. It's too big. It's something that requires pretty much an entire item reset. And the types of things I think that they could do quite easily to go in this direction is to put more differentiation between casters, melee, ranged, physical damage, magic damage, and that sort of stuff. And you'd break up the skills in a way so that they're not all based on weapon damage like they are right now. At the moment, virtually every single skill in the entire game is based on a percentage of weapon damage. What if you change that? What if you made it so fire damage, Hydra is no longer, your weapon doesn't really, it's not based on that. It's based on other things like your total fire damage or your total arcane damage or whatever your rune is. And that's sort of what I was hoping they would move towards. Now, if you're saying, you want something a bit less, Blizzard might not have the development capacity to make such a drastic change at this point of the game's life cycle. Well, there are ways of still achieving that whilst, not completely overhauling the game. Simple things like changing how attributes relate to each other. Things like I mentioned before, changing certain skills so they no longer just look at your actual DPS and base the damage on that. Include affixes like plus fire damage, plus casting speed, that sort of thing. And that's how I would do it if I was trying to achieve this.
Bashiok's grandma is like just staring at you with a blank expression right now. So, I mean, we joke because Bashiok, I think, actually mentioned at one point that the game had to be designed so his grandma can understand it. But I mean, this might be mutually incompatible. I mean, obviously, Blizzard has this whole slogan of, it's a minute to learn and a lifetime to master kind of thing. But, maybe there's just some sense you can't make that much diversity and variety and complexity if you want to keep it to be accessible. Are we just screwed here?
She should buy the console version, I think, and they can keep that system on the console version. I don't know. I mean, what would you guys rather see? I mean, we're a bit biased because we're sort of on the hardcore side of the community. We aren't casual players. We play this game quite seriously. But to me, I think there is a
what's
perfect
what's this
medium.
wee pale face? You got a level 40 monk.
When I say hardcore, I mean not literally hardcore. I mean like we play the game a lot. Hardcore.
Well, you think about the game a lot. You don't actually play the game a lot, but yes. Well, that's the whole thing. Is the console just for casuals and to have fun? What percent of the market? I mean, it's always this comes up a lot of video game conversations. Is that patches and in-game stuff tend to always be about the 1% who plays the game a million hours.
Yeah.
And those are the people who post on Battle.net and complain about things. And that kind of that's the horse driving the wagon,
Yeah, I guess.
And then
my perspective is probably more on the sense of what's a better game rather than what sells the best or what sells the most copies, and that's where my opinions might differ a lot to currently Blizzard's current thinking, and I don't blame them for that. I mean, it is a business. I'm just saying this is what I think would make looking just at the game itself, what would make a game better.
Bigger numbers. That makes every game better.
Yeah, that's their current philosophy, I think. Just put a few more zeros.
You guys saw the screenshots of the items, the legendaries people are finding on the console, and that's kind of what we've been saying. They're the same thing with bigger numbers, and that doesn't seem like it's going to change any of the issues. And everyone's really enthusiastic about the console right now and finding good stuff. But we've had this argument about 20 times, Azzure. Raising the floor. Maybe it doesn't change the fundamentals, for the 1% long term, but it makes it a lot more fun for every casual. And Bashiok's grandma is having the best time ever, right? So,
Sure.
I mean, Blizzard. People tend to think that obviously the people on this podcast and most of our listeners are pretty hardcore players, whether literally or figuratively or both. In Xanth's case, because he's super hardcore, because he's mastered the Witch Doctor.
It's a gift.
Yeah, it only took you 7 of them, but anyway, but. Yes, we tend to want everything in the game to be how we want it and to affect stuff that we really want changed. And Blizzard isn't gonna, there's not gonna be some developer blog saying, "Hey, everybody reading this on Battle.net forums, we don't really care about you because we've already got your money and we're trying to get the casuals interested with this feature, but that's what it's for." But obviously, they do have some priority on developing features that aren't just appealing to people who have level 100 Witch Doctors.
I think that is
fair.
I think that is their dilemma. And like I said, I don't necessarily think that they don't know what it takes to fix it. I mean, they might, I don't know, but they don't appear to be pushing in that direction. And it's unfortunate for people like us. I mean, I think you raise a good point in that just because the hardcore community it increases the longevity of the game doesn't mean that it's a better product, because there's a lot more people that are casual that would prefer to be able to get quick and easy big numbers quite quickly. I do think the console demographic point I made earlier is applies here in that the console, you have to build a game depending on the platform and the people playing it, and the console is obviously geared towards much more quicker progression, less. It's a much more short term game. Console games average like maybe a few days until someone finishes it and gets sick of it. Apart from those multiplayer games, but the fundamentals are a console is more of a casual, short term thing. So they could be in fact designing the game perfectly for console, and I'm not disputing that. I think the console version is doing what it's supposed to do very well. But as far as a game that I would like to play, and I think in the long term, the hardcore fans are what make the company what it currently is. I think that they've steered a bit too far into the direction of is this casual friendly, and have not really given enough to given back to the hardcore gamers, who are the ones who play the games year after year. They buy the games from the same developer year after year, and they support the developer. So I think it's a very hard subject for them, and I don't know what I would do in that case. But yeah, I mean that's how I think it currently is at the moment.
People have been complaining a great deal about, calling it Loot 1.5 and why can't we have the console features in the game right now? And, A, that wouldn't really change anything long term, as we've just been discussing it. And B, imagine if they really had done all the Loot 2.0, it was in the console. Imagine the complaints then.
Yeah.
And now they've actually diversified it and all the stuff we were just talking about, build changing gear. There'd really be complaints. What Randkill said on the last podcast about the console is that people have been making the joke that the PC version has been the beta test for the console, right? And what he said is the console is actually the beta test for Loot 2.0. It's like trying out some of the very basic features of it and seeing how things change with increased drop rates and better legendaries,
Mm.
but not really doing anything else, and not having Paragon 2.0 and not having any of the other major features. So it's almost like they're using the console to test out a little bit of the stuff that we're going to get later, and it's making our experience better eventually.
One thing I would advise caution on Blizzard's part is when you're comparing item systems between the console and the PC version, you have to, and this is the mistake that happened in the beta, you have to account for the auction house. They had no idea what the auction house ended up doing until release, because there was no real community beta testing the game in the sense that there was a real economy. So they even admitted that the fact that the beta did not include the auction house for the most part, and like a proper economy, made it a huge shock to them in how everything turned out in regards to the auction house. So I think they need to remember that lesson and ensure that just because an item system might feel 10 times better on the console, without an auction house, it's a completely different system. And the point I'll bring up in that is that on the console, if there's no auction house, then everything's self-found. So you have to have that really high item. You got to increase the floor on items and make sure that you're not sitting there, farming day in day out, and not getting an upgrade. You have to have the ability to build up your character fairly quickly, because you don't have the auction house to outfit yourself in a few clicks. So that part I would say would make it a really, if loot on the console feels really good right now, I wouldn't conclude that the PC version, applying these changes to the PC version, will achieve the same effect. And I hope they remember that lesson from the beta, and they don't make that conclusion.
That's a good point. I think back to Josh at Gamescom bringing up the drop rates and, raising the amount of legendaries that we'll be finding. And, you know, I understand what they're doing and how that will, encourage people to find more and not jump to the auction house. But in the back of my head, when I was watching that, I'm like, well, that will just make it easier for me to buy something on the auction house, as opposed to, finding it myself. Because I still feel like my luck would not be as great. Um, and then I'm curious as to, with more legendaries coming in, what that will do. And I think Azur's right. If it's not tested properly, it could be chaos,
Chaos.
anarchy.
Oh, even worse. Okay, that's kind of it for our loot 1.5 stuff. You're going away now, Azure. You can
Yeah,
go hide the toys and clean up the house
yep. All those
before the
tasks.
parental unit arrives. Okay,
Yep.
Azure, thanks for your time.
Okay, thanks guys. Have a good one.